So none of what we've talked about this weekend, leadership, service, impact, works if people are doing it running on empty. We talk a lot about Rotary does. We don't talk enough about how we sustain the people who are doing the work. And so to introduce our next speaker, please welcome Gretchen Stein.
Good morning, Rotarians. It's a beautiful day in Minnesota. It is my pleasure to introduce a mental health professional I have known for decades. I'll just tell you a teeny bit about me. For 25 years, I ran a behavioral health care company, and we served thousands of people a year. And when I needed to send one of my own loved ones or close friends, actually a family member, to a professional who could help with depression and anxiety, of all the people I know, and I know thousands of mental health professionals, the person I called is Dr. Henry Emmons. So I'm delighted that he said yes when I called to ask him to speak to us today. If you don't know Henry Emmons, and I know many of you already do, he is an integrative psychiatrist who weaves together mind, body, and natural therapies, mindfulness, both Eastern and Western therapies in his work. He is an incredible bright star in the field of mental health. He attained his medical degrees from the University of Iowa College of Medicine, did his residency in psychiatry at the University of Rochester Medical Center, where he was the chief resident. He's the author of 2 best-selling books, The Chemistry of Joy and The Chemistry of Calm. The Chemistry of Joy focuses on depression, The Chemistry of Calm on anxiety. What year did you publish Chemistry of Joy, do you know? 2006, and I've helped him sell a zillion of these. Chemistry of Joy, you know it. It actually comes with a workbook, and it focuses on what he knows about the integration of mind, body, and spirit. He has created practical, accessible programs, including A Year of Living Mindfully, The Inner Life of Healers, Resiliency Training, and The Pathway to Joy. And he's spoken to and trained health professionals around the world. I didn't know this until I asked him to speak today, but he has worked with Rotary outbound youth to prepare them for the demands of living away from the United States. So will you please give a warm Rotary welcome to Dr. Henry Emmons.
Thanks, Gretchen. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for being here early on a Saturday morning. So I'm going to use my time to kind of take us through a relatively quick tour of my understanding of resilience. So resilience, we'll talk more about what I mean by that, but I think we all have a good sense for it. And it's not the only important factor in well-being, but it's a really critical one, especially for our mental health and well-being. So I want to frame my comments with this quotation, and some of you might recognize the name of the person who said this. Margaret Mitchell wrote Gone with the Wind. So it's a quote that's been around a while, and I just love it for this topic. She says, every problem has 2 handles. You can grab it by the handle of fear or the handle of hope. And this is, I think, a really good stance to take when it comes to people who struggle with things like anxiety, depression, or really any stress-related problem. But before we talk about the focus on hope and what we can do about this, we do want to talk about kind of where we're at. What are we confronting? What's the challenge in front of us? And there, I mean, I don't think I need to, I'm not sharing any secrets here. There are big challenges that we all are facing individually and collectively right now. And they're not small. They are significant. But just to put a little perspective with some statistics here, in the last 110 years, along with the US Census, every 10 years, scientists do a sampling of people in our country, asking them questions about their mental health and well-being. So we've got over 100 years of data now. And the questions they ask are very much like what a clinician would ask about depression and anxiety. So from this data, we can see that every 10 years, there's about another 10% increase in the rates of depression and anxiety. So that's significant. That's not a small thing, especially when you realize over 100 years that it grows somewhat exponentially. It's not a straight line. It goes up quickly. In children and teens, rates of depression have increased 60% just since the year 2009. Rates of suicide across all ages have gone up just in that 5-year period or 15-year period when it was measured. Rates went up by 24%, which is just a huge increase. And among teens, this has really kind of reached crisis proportion. Another perspective on this is to look at how many people are disabled by something like depression. And few people realize this, but depression is the #1 cause of disability in the United States, and it has been for a long time. Interestingly, that has not been true in other parts of the world. For whatever reason, rates have been higher here in the US, and it's been more likely to be severe and disabling, but that's rapidly changing. The rest of the world is quickly catching up with us in this statistic, so that by the year 2030 now, the World Health Organization estimates depression will be the #1 cause of disability worldwide. I have never really worked with children or adolescents, except college students are still adolescents, at least part of their time. And I've done a lot of work with college students over the years. And this is no secret either, that just in the last few years or decades, the rates of anxiety and depression in college students have kind of gone through the roof. And I think the pandemic just speeded that up really significantly. So 1/3 of college students have had trouble functioning in the past year due to depression. This is from recent surveys. A half of them have felt overwhelmed, not just anxious, but overwhelmed by anxiety. And fully a third are taking medications to treat anxiety and depression. Those are huge numbers. So with that, and I'm sure, if you work with Rotary students, you see some of these challenges. I know that. I've been involved with some of that. So let's switch to resilience, talking about what can we do to shore that up, because one way of looking at these increased rates of mental health problems is that our resilience as a collective has been eroded. It's been declining for lots of reasons, and we don't understand all of them. I think we understand some, or we can speculate, but I think a good way to look at this is that our natural ability to face whatever we need to face and keep going or get back up if it knocks us down, that's how I think of resilience, pretty simply. That natural ability has been challenged and taken down a couple notches, and we need to think about how we get it back up. How do we restore ourselves? The image I have here, you see that water cooler image is just my very simple way of thinking about how within each one of us, let's say in our brains somewhere, there's this container that has an elixir that keeps us afloat, that keeps us able to face whatever challenges we need to. And all of us have this. Resilience is not just for a few people, it's everybody has it. but we do have different size containers based on two very important things. One is genetics. You can look at your family tree, and if there's lots of people that have struggled, chances are higher that you also will have inherited some genes that make you more susceptible to this. So genetics plays a role in this. Usually the estimate is it's about 50% of the reason why one person might struggle more than another. That's a big percentage, but it's only half. The other half of the equation is all kinds of other things that we have more control over. We can't change our genetics exactly, although we might be able to do that in a few years. But all the other things we do have some say over. So I mentioned there's two things. One is genetics. The other big factor in our capacity to be resilient is the early childhood experience that we've had. So it's the milieu that we grew up in, the people around us, how nurturing they were, how attentive they were, whether we as children experienced trauma of some sort or any kind of deprivation. And interestingly, we think of trauma, like, some sort of sexual abuse or physical violence as being, really the worst thing that can happen. And it is, of course, terrible. But in terms of putting people at risk, it might even be worse to grow up without adequate nurturing. Being adequately nurtured is really key. So those are two things that might set the capacity for resilience. But after working as a psychiatrist for almost 35 years now, I can tell you, no matter how resilient someone is, they can still experience something like depression and anxiety. Any one of us, no matter how naturally upbeat and positive we are, has the potential of kind of being taken down by circumstances. So that's the other huge factor, is what are the external circumstances. And we can only control those things to some degree. What we do have control over is largely what I want to focus the rest of my comments on, and it's the things we do to take care of our bodies, to take care of our brains, to work with our minds and thoughts, our emotions, our heart. So it's the things we have some say over that we want to focus on. Now, I do want to add that the size of one's capacity to face adversity, while it's important, I think it's even more important that one is able to keep this container full enough with this magical elixir I'm talking about, just full enough that when something else comes around that we have to handle, we have enough within us to do it. So the real key is not how big your container is, it's how good are you at keeping it relatively filled. And that means, what do we do to stop the draining of this? Because there are things that are taking this out of us. And then what do we need to do better to keep filling ourselves up? So that's what we want to focus on. So I'm going to do this through what I call the roots of resilience. We'll go through, there's a host of them. And I'm a believer in focusing on the body and also the mind and also the spirit. So I'm going to focus on all of those. I think they're all important, perhaps equally, but for any individual, it might be one realm is more important than the other. But we're going to kind of try to be really comprehensive today. I love this quote, by the way, because it says, "Spring comes and the grass grows by itself." Good time of year to talk about this. I like this as a way of thinking about resilience because I do consider it something that's very natural to us. And if we simply take away the things that are preventing this grass from growing, if we just allow the season to change, it will come back. It will grow back in our lives. So it's not like we have to fix ourselves. We don't have to think about putting huge amounts of effort towards doing better, feeling better. If we take away the things that are draining us, that are keeping us from this, it will spring back to life to a very large degree. So the first root of resilience in my thinking is to balance our brain chemistry, which is largely done through diet, through what we put into our bodies. Our bodies are very well designed to produce what we need to produce, and all these feel-good brain chemicals we hear about, like serotonin and dopamine, we are very capable of making those as long as our bodies have the ingredients they need to do so. Now, that doesn't mean that some people with a clinical form of depression doesn't benefit from medication. They certainly might. But in terms of most of us, and even people who do have more of an illness, giving the body what it needs to do its job properly is really crucial. So this is something for everybody, not just people who struggle, but as a preventive kind of thing. I'm going to give us a very simple way of thinking about diet, which is to imagine how our ancestors ate about 2 generations ago. Let's say, 50 to 100 years ago, before we got so good at processing foods and mass producing them, and so it's pretty simple, really. But in our day and age, it doesn't happen naturally like it used to. All the food that we used to get was seasonal because that was what was available. It was largely fresh or freshly grown, at least in season. It was local to where we live, so our bodies had adapted to it. It was grown in soil that had adequate minerals and vitamins that the food could absorb, so it would get into our bodies that way. We didn't have processed foods that shoot our blood sugar up really quickly and really too high for our bodies to handle. So there's just all these changes that have occurred in just a generation, or probably two generations now. That's too soon for our bodies to adapt to it. Maybe we will eventually, but we don't adapt to major changes like that in just a couple of generations. So, most of us do okay, but if we're struggling, and I would say particularly as we're aging, there's really 2 things we want to minimize. One is inflammation, and inflammation is, if it's happening in other parts of your body, it's also happening in your brain. And the second is this blood sugar control. So these metabolism and inflammation are really 2 key things that we want to keep focusing on. The simplest way to do that is to eat foods that contain a lot of fiber. The fiber hasn't been taken out of it, and are largely plant-based, and that include lots of bright colors. The bright colors indicate there's lots of different micronutrients in them that we all need. So I want to shift gear to, I'm going to sprinkle in a little more neuroscience along the way here. I'll try to make it really understandable from my point of view. And I want to talk here a little bit about something called genetic expression. I referred to our genes as one of the things we can't change, but this is an interesting twist on that. We might have genes for a certain illness. We might have inherited that from our parents, and yet it might never become activated to that illness throughout our whole lives. It might never become activated. Being present, the gene being present, does not mean that it's going to show up in our lives. There's a lot of other factors that determine that, and that's what's called genetic expression. And the way I think of it is that, starting with the DNA, that little spiral you see here, that contains the blueprint, but the building is only made if the message from that blueprint gets out to the workers in the cells. That requires a lot of different steps. There's like a series of gateways that the information has to go through. And what we can do to influence this is we can do things to try to shut down or close the gateways that produce illness, that might produce illness. And here are some ways we can do this. These are some things we know that modify genetic expression. On the negative side, things that more likely activate these illness genes are things we know about: alcohol, tobacco, what's known as endocrine disruptors, which means things that affect our own hormones. And these are things that are in our water and food sources. So we have to really be kind of thoughtful about what we choose to put in our bodies, if at all possible, using foods and water that's pure and not running the risk of being contaminated. We can't do that 100%. We don't need to, but as much as we can. And then thirdly, this is the important one that I want to stress, is the effect of long-term stress. We're going to come back to this. We are designed for stress. Stress is not the problem. The problem is when it goes on too long or is too strong. But that's one of the things that definitely can activate illness genes, particularly in the realm of mental and emotional problems. On the positive side, these are things that help turn off or keep illness genes from being expressed in the first place. It's important, I think, that illness genes, once they've been activated, can also be turned off again. Getting an illness doesn't mean it's going to be there forever. And here are some things. The bright colors again, the phytonutrients in fruits and vegetables, exercise, which I'm going to come back to, and the cultivation of positive emotions. So on the one side we've got stress and the effects of long-term stress. On the other side we've got the cultivation of positive emotions, which is something we can do something about. Michael Pollan, the author who some of you I'm sure know or maybe have even read, he summed up his dietary recommendations in 7 words. Somebody challenged him to, because there's so much information out there, it's so confusing, and they challenged him to just, encapsulate it in 7 words, and he did a really good job. Eat food, sounds obvious, but the point is eat real food, food that has not been changed from its original form. Not too much, this is absolutely key, not eating so much that we shoot our blood sugar up too high. Again, that's the key. And then mostly plants. Just brilliant. The second root of resilience has to do with how we manage our energy. This is critical to how we feel, particularly, I think, as we age. There's a lot of things that happen to the energy production in our body that happens in every single cell, including the brain. And we really have to attend to this if we want to stay focused, alert, relatively healthy, having the energy to do the things that we want. Interestingly, in order to produce energy, we have to expend it. I think probably the best thing we can do long term to keep our energy up is to move our bodies. So exercising. These are the guidelines from the Center for Disease Control about how much exercise adults need: 2.5 hours a week, which is not terribly much. Over 70, or doing 75 minutes that's a little more vigorous, and then doing some form of strength training, which can be really anything: gardening, housework, lifting light weights. Doesn't have to be dramatic. So 2.5 hours a week. How many people in the US do you think meet that criteria? What percentage of people? It's about 25 or 30%. which is not very good. I want to share with you a little story, true story that I experienced. This is probably 15, 20 years ago now, when I was speaking to an elder hostel group at the University of Minnesota. I was 20 years younger, but I already had gray hair. But this group these were people in their probably late 70s and 80s by and large. And we were having a back and forth discussion about why is depression more common now than it used to be. And one of the things that I said was that it's because life is harder now than it used to be. I just said that to my parents' generation, that life is harder now than it was for them, which you all know was ridiculous to say. And they put me in my place. They very quickly, reminded me what life was like for them growing up. And interesting, this is my point, is that although they all lived in the Twin Cities at the time, they almost all grew up on farms. And so if you think about getting 2.5 hours a week of exercise, that was no problem if you grew up on a farm, right? And so remember that we evolved to be moving for, gently, not doing, these intense workouts at the gym necessarily, but to be moving our bodies periodically throughout the day, probably 6 days a week or whatever. So we can't change evolution over a couple of generations. Our bodies are designed to move. We need to do that. I did learn another thing by that experience, by the way, which is you just don't ever tell your elders that you had it, that they had it easier than you do. That's just not it. Teens need more exercise, obviously, an hour a day, mostly aerobic, including some strengthening activities. So here are some ways to think about how to incorporate movement. I think of movement rather than exercise. I just think it makes more sense for most of us. For those who tend more toward anxiety, the best form of movement is a gentle aerobic activity that is continuous. Something that you do for, let's say, 45 minutes or more a day. There's very good research on this. It does not need to be super intense. In fact, it's probably better if it's not. But moving in a rhythmic way, being outdoors in nature, of course, gives a lot of added benefits. For people who are more depressed and sluggish, this is sort of a sad irony that those people need more intensive exercise. It's sad because it's hard to do it. If you're lacking motivation, it's very hard to do it. But if they can get their energy and motivation up just a little bit, just enough to get moving, taking a class makes it a lot easier because there's other people to do it with, doing some sort of water aerobics or whatever it is, but something that's a little more vigorous is really, really helpful at getting people out of or preventing people from getting into a more sluggish form of depression. And then really for anybody, doing something that is more mindful, more reflective, like walking in nature, a really gentle bike ride, easy, walking with a friend and talking are just really, really great. I want to mention neurogenesis. We talked about gene expression. Neurogenesis means that the brain is capable of creating new brain cells, essentially replacing cells that have been lost. Now we know the rest of the body does this, right? If you get a cut on your skin, it heals itself. If your doctors take out part of your liver for some reason, it can grow some of it back. Maybe not all, but quite a bit of it back. The body is really well designed to replace and repair itself. We did not think that the brain could do that until a couple of decades ago when somebody started to study this and realized that, sure enough, even near the end of life, because they originally did these studies with people who were terminally ill, and they were in a hospital setting, and they were very sick, and they were by and large quite elderly, and all of this plays into the ability to create new cells. And what they found is that even then, even at the end stages of life, later in life, people were creating new brain cells constantly. Now, if you have a stroke or something and you lose a big number of brain cells, you won't grow all of them back. But we have learned in just the last years that you can grow quite a bit of capacity back, way more than we thought before, through the right kind of rehab. And the same is true for us as we're aging, or people who have gone through some kind of mental health, real bad mental health challenge. The way I think of it is that in about 6 months to a year, you can replace enough brain cells with new ones that can be healthier, that you can create essentially a different brain than you had before. But it does take time. It doesn't happen in weeks. It takes, I think, a good 6 to 12 months. Now, when a new brain cell is created, it has to move and connect with other brain cells in order to survive. And there is a chemical that helps it do that. It's called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which you do not need to remember. I think of it as Miracle-Gro for your brain. It is fertilizer for these brain cells. And here's what you can do to make that work better. Exercise shows up again. We talked about this earlier, and I think it's important to note, again, low level, not too intense exercise seems to be better for the purposes of these brain cells surviving, better than doing the really intensive stuff. Now, there's other reasons to do intensive exercise, don't get me wrong, but for most of us, for our health and well-being and protecting the brain as we age, low level, but doing it frequently is the key. Second thing is an enriched environment. What does that mean? A lot of research on this was done with lab animals, so lab rats, essentially. And for a lab rat, an enriched environment essentially means these three things. It means having something that challenges them, like learning a maze or some other kind of difficult thing, difficult for them. Second thing is having toys to play with. And third is having playmates to play with. It's not that different for us humans. We need something to challenge ourselves. So this is one way where stress becomes a good thing, a little bit of stress. Having to learn something new that might be frustrating at first, that we're not good at, that makes us really work our brain, and then mastering it or resolving the puzzle or the problem is very, very good for the brain. So challenging ourselves to do something difficult repeatedly throughout our lives. And then having toys, basically playing, and having other people to play with or to be with. Those are the three key things that create this enriched environment. Third, diet shows up here again, and it's very similar to what we talked about before. Not eating too much, getting those bright phytonutrients, and then getting plenty of omega-3, which we do through seafood, olive oil, nuts, and seeds, essentially. Those are the good sources of omega-3. Serotonin, that good brain chemical for depression, is really important here, and then so is social connection. For lab rats, social connection is super easy. You just put another rat in their cage and they've got social connection. Human beings, we know it's not quite that easy, but the research on this is pretty convincing that having social connection is just really, really key to all kinds of health issues. So age makes a difference here too. As we age, we are not as good at creating these new brain cells. So there's 6 factors here, if you count age. So this list of 5 plus age, which do you think is the most crucial for producing new brain cells that are healthy and survive. It's social connection, which I find really interesting. It's better than all the rest. So in the study, somebody compared lab rats, and they found that those who were young and exercising and eating all the right things did not do as well as the old rats that got to hang out with other old rats. They just did better. And so the social connection is key.
Needs to become a Rotarian.
They need to become Rotarians, yes. I am aware of that. Okay. So I do realize that exercise is not something everybody naturally gravitates to and loves to do. And there's some research on this too. So the picture here is of a Dr. Levine, who, I don't know if he's still at the Mayo Clinic, but he's been there for decades. And he created this, this research in the field that he called NEAT. NEAT was his acronym. It stands for Non-Exercise Activated Thermogenesis. Thermogenesis basically means you're burning calories, okay? So non-exercise is the key here. Dr. Levine, as his story goes, used to weigh something like 300 pounds. And he could just not lose weight through diet. He's obviously smart enough to know how to eat properly, and he hated exercise. So he's the person that did the research on a standing desk with a treadmill. Okay, and that's what he's doing here. And he lost all this weight, and it showed all these incredible health benefits from just barely moving, basically. Just the treadmill's not set to run. It's just you stand on it for some hours a day, and it's barely moving, but it is moving. That's kind of the point. So right now, just me standing up here, moving around a little bit, shifting weight, I am doing non-exercise. The point being that if we intentionally incorporate some movement over the course of our days, we are doing this. Taking the stairs, walking a little ways from your car to the store, parking a block away or something like that, getting up and taking breaks, not sitting for more than 45 minutes to an hour without standing up, moving around a little bit. These things really do make a difference. The third root of resilience is to remember our need for natural rhythms, align ourselves with nature. And the thing I really want to focus on here is rest, okay? Sleep is the most important aspect of lifestyle in terms of mental health. I am convinced of that. I think it might be the most important thing for all forms of health. Sleep does so many good things for our brain. It helps us turn down inflammation. It helps the body's metabolism. So we talked about, sugar, glucose metabolism. Sleep does a lot of things for mental well-being, including helping us to work through problems. One of the really interesting things about dreaming sleep is that when we are dreaming, when we are in REM sleep, the stress system is essentially shut off. It's turned off completely. And so we can, even if we have distressing dreams, we're doing so in the context of essentially no stress hormones. And so it's a way of the brain working through challenging things in a safe, non-stressed environment, so to speak. So it's thought that our dreams are part of what allow us to work through challenging things in our lives safely. So how do we sleep better? Let me say this: as we age, we often think that we need less sleep. We think that. It's not true. We don't need less sleep, we just tend to get less sleep for all kinds of reasons. And as I'm aging, I'm very aware this is a problem that's not easy to solve, okay? I don't want to say that right off the bat. This is a challenging thing. So we do what we can, and here are some things that we can do. One thing that does impact sleep is how much caffeine we take in, and I think we've kind of gotten the idea that as long as we stop drinking caffeine by noon, it's not going to affect our sleep. It's probably not true. So if you're having trouble sleeping, my advice would be to, for sure, not have it after noon, probably not have it after breakfast, and if it's still a problem, start cutting back until you're sleeping better or you're off caffeine altogether. So it does impact sleep even early in the day. Something that helps is to not overeat in the evening. You probably noticed this, I definitely do now. If I eat too much late in the day, I do not sleep as well. Your body's working too hard to break down and metabolize your food. So I think it makes a ton of sense. If your bedtime is roughly 10 o'clock, don't eat anything heavy after 7 or 8 o'clock. Give yourself 2 or 3 hours to digest before you go to bed. And then if you get hungry during the night, have a little light snack before bedtime. That does help. Something else that helps a lot is think about biorhythms. And the most important thing about staying in a good biorhythm is the time we get up in the morning. The time we go to bed, it is not as important, and it usually will work itself out if we are good at getting up at the same time every day. And the best way to keep our wake-up time consistent is to get some bright light exposure first thing in the morning. The device that I have in the picture here is called a dawn simulator, and I use one of these. I have one right next to my bed where you basically set the time for when you want to get up, and about 20 or 30 minutes before that, this light starts to come on very slowly until it gets quite bright. And even though your eyes are closed, you're getting the signal that the sun is rising, which is not as important this time of year, but it's really important in November and December, right? So it's just a super easy, quick, not terribly expensive way of trying to get that signal that you're getting up when the sun is getting up. The fourth root of resilience is to learn how to work with our thoughts and our minds and keep our minds a little bit calmer. So I'm sure you remember the economic crash of 2008. And you might remember Larry Summers, who was the White House economic czar at the time, I think. And he said something really interesting. He said fear begets fear. It is contagious. And he attributed really that entire, or at least a large part of the crash, the severity of it, to this tendency we have as humans to spread fear through our thinking, really. And so we are designed to be more attuned to what's wrong and what creates fear than we are to what's right or what makes us feel good. It's just a survival thing. We just automatically turn toward that which we find threatening in order to protect ourselves. But it does us harm when it creates fear, and then we start to spread that. So I mentioned stress earlier, that stress itself is not the problem. It's not a bad thing. In fact, the idea of stress is something that we made up about 100-some years ago, taking a physics term and applying it to the human condition. It's not really a thing. We've just created it to be a thing. And one of the ways of thinking about how do we work with this is to compare how we humans deal with threat to how it happens in the natural world. So there's a book here, the title of which is at the top of the slide, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. It's written by Robert Sapolsky, a neuroscientist, and he says basically that in the natural world, life sometimes is incredibly stressful. If you're being chased by, you know, a lion or a cheetah or something, and you're a zebra in the wild, it's really stressful. But the difference is, animals don't suffer from chronic stress because they don't carry it with them, but we humans do. This slide was Photoshopped before AI, I think. This is not how it really happens, but we people have evolved. This is a quote from his book. We've evolved to be smart enough to make ourselves sick. In other words, it is how we react, how we hold on to things, how we think about things that really creates the problem. So there is good stress and there's bad stress. The good stress is something that you use to kind of focus yourself, apply yourself, get motivated, face and hopefully overcome a challenge. That's really good. The bad stress is when it just goes on too long and becomes too acute. So there's a window of tolerance, we say. And if you stay within that window, you feel good. It's perfectly fine to be stressed from time to time. In fact, most of us do not feel as good if we have no stress in our lives, if there's just nothing going on. We might enjoy it for a little while, don't get me wrong, but as a way to live, it's not really good for us. Now there's also a new concept known as the window of resilience. This is something I just came across, a study came across my inbox just a week or two ago. And what the scientists did here is they looked at people who suffer from an acute stress, a really intense acute stress. And we know that some people who go through a big stress develop post-traumatic stress disorder and others don't. And what's the difference? So one way of looking at this is that they measured brain activity through a magnetic resonance image and an EEG, and they're able to see in real time what parts of the brain are active and how much, and then what parts are calmer. And what they find is that within about an hour, there's this, for people who do not carry this with them, there is this kind of resetting of the brain. It settles itself down. It does get activated, it goes, we feel, all the stuff that anybody would feel when you're traumatized or threatened. But within an hour or so, it all settles down for those people who are really resilient, okay? There's a difference, something is different about them. So what might be that difference? I want to frame this in terms of neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity means that the brain is creating pathways, and we are creating pathways. I think, we are creating pathways that we don't know we're doing. We're not aware of it necessarily, but we're doing it all the time. And the brain is changing. It's being reshaped all the time. So here's what influences neuroplasticity. Practice makes pattern. We are creating these pathways with what we are practicing in our minds. I want to share the study with you, and then we're gonna end. But before I go into the study, I just want to say, give you kind of a visual picture of how I imagine this happening. So picture yourself standing in front of a grassy meadow, and nobody has walked across this yet. It's just a long, tall, wavy grass. And then you decide to walk across it one time, and you look back, and you can see very faintly where you have walked, okay? But it is not a path yet. If you don't walk it again, the grass will just go upright again, and nobody will be able to tell that you were there. That is what happens when we learn something new or we experience something new, but we haven't reinforced it, we haven't practiced it. Or when we have a certain emotional reaction or a negative thought, let's say, or a positive thought for that matter. We've walked across this pathway, we've created neural connections, but unless they're reinforced, it just disappears. Then imagine you walk that same route across the meadow over and over and over again. You do it every day, maybe many times a day. In a matter of weeks, you've got a real path. And long enough period of time, there's no grass on the path, it's just a little rutted path. That's what happens when we keep reinforcing over and over and over again the same thoughts, the same habits, the same emotional reaction to something in our lives, holding on to something, or resentment, or what have you. We're creating a pathway. Now let's say that we realize at some point this is not good for us, that this is hurting me to keep holding on to these feelings, and we want to get rid of it. It is as simple as learning to stop walking that path. Now, I say it's simple. We do have to have some awareness that we're doing it. We have to be conscious enough of what's happening inside of ourselves that we can see it, or we can feel the emotions, and we know, okay, I'm doing this again. You don't want to beat yourself up. You just want to notice it. I'm doing this again, and I choose not to reinforce this. And simply stepping aside and choosing not to go down that path, with enough time, the path starts to grow over again and eventually disappear. Now, if it was a real rutted path, it won't disappear entirely. You can bring it back to life very quickly, but having that skill of being able to see that we're doing it, step aside from it, we can allow those unhelpful pathways to gradually disappear. On the flip side, let's say there's a pathway you want to create because you know it's good for you. We referred to this earlier, the cultivating positive emotions. This is something we can do purposely. In fact, we need to do it purposely because it doesn't happen just on its own. So for example, let's say it's gratitude. We want to cultivate more gratitude. We have to practice it over and over and over again. Let's say it's compassion for other people, kindness, generosity, any of these things that we know are just really good for us, and we might naturally kind of be inclined towards it, but to really make it part of who we are, we just have to keep doing it again and again and again. We can do that purposely, just very briefly, taking a few moments to bring any of those things to mind or any other qualities you want and keep working with it again and again. So I want to share this study then, and then I'm going to bring this to a close. Researchers were looking at how practicing something changes the brain. And what they did was they got a group of, I guess, college students or grad students to practice a musical piece by playing it on a keyboard with one hand. Okay, so let's just say they're using their right hand, and then they're measuring what happens in the opposite side of the brain, right, because it crosses over. So for about 2 hours a day, for 2 weeks, they're playing this tune, simple tune, with the right hand on the piano, and in 2 weeks' time, the part of the brain that controls hand movement grew by about 20%, which is really significant. That's not surprising, though, because if it's very similar to if you decided you wanted to get stronger and you took a dumbbell in your right arm, just your right arm, and you used it every day for 2 weeks, you're going to have bigger muscles in the right arm than the left, okay? That just seems natural. Then they did something very different, very interesting. They took a different group of students and gave them the same exact instructions with one big difference. They didn't actually move their hand. They only imagined moving their hand. So in 2 weeks, guess what happened? without moving, the part of the brain that controls hand movement grew by about the same 20% as it did when people actually moved. I know some of you right now are thinking to yourselves, this means I don't actually have to exercise. I know that. I've thought about that myself. It's not what that means. Although you could try it. But what it says to me is that our minds are really powerful, and they are recreating themselves over and over again, every day. And they're doing it by what we are doing with our own thoughts, our own minds. So this is something, it might sound a little vague or esoteric. This is not hard to learn. This is something that you can be learned pretty quickly and pretty easily, just by learning to observe your thoughts and your emotional reactions. So getting a better skill at doing this really pays off. I'm going to close just by mentioning a podcast that I do that you might want to check into during the month of May, and I'll tell you why. The podcast is called Joy Lab, and it's a weekly podcast that we focus really on positive psychology, mindfulness, cognitive behavioral therapy, some of the things we've talked about today, but really going into a lot more depth. But in May, we're doing a series on resilience, and we're including anybody. The podcast is always free. There's also a program that people who can choose to pay a minimal amount for. But in the month of May, that program is also free, and we're really focusing on some of these skills I'm talking about, particularly the mind and heart-based skills that focus on resilience. So if you're interested in going deeper into that, you can just go on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or any wherever you do that, or you can go to joylab.coach and it'll be free access to you in May. So thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure to be here. Oh, sure. Yeah, I have time for questions if you do.
Questions?
Exercise.
Thank you so much for a great presentation. I really enjoyed it. My question has to do with the functional MRI slide. How did they give the people in the study the stress for an hour and a half?
Yeah, great question. So the stress occurred before that hour and a half. It was a brief stress, but I don't know exactly how they do this, but it's called a cold pressor. And so I think what they do is they probably put their hand in an ice bath or something. It's some form of real extreme cold that creates discomfort but doesn't harm them. And so it's like a physical stress. And then they measured, then they stopped the stress, and then they measuring over the next hour and a half. That's a great question.
Oh, it's me. Okay. All right. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, this is really, really good.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. And someone who does, I do ECTs, which is those electric shocks for patients every week. And, every time I'm in that ECT room, I feel just the pain that a lecture like this, I think, could rescue so many, because I have patients all the way from children to 80-year-olds, and I'm always feeling like they are missing life, because if they had some of the things you're saying, I don't know if psychiatrists don't offer that in the clinics. I just feel like if they had some of this, they would probably not be where they are. I only say that because I lost my sister from ALS in 2003, and I tried to drop out of medical school. I tried to drop out of residency. And it's really amazing that the only thing that turned me around was someone, my academic advisor, being encouraging, okay? Because I was like, I could see no end. I'm done. This is bad. And then I found this book called The Power of Positive Thinking. And I took it and I read it. I mean, I could recite it. It kept me away from a psychiatrist, which is not good for business for you.
No worries, there's plenty of business.
But I talk about this all the time to my patients. The power of positive thinking. It really rescued me. And now I've been in practice for more than 30 years. And I'm like, wow, some things are really simple but difficult. Especially when I have people attempting suicide. And it's endless. Anyway,
Yeah.
that's just an FYI. The other thing I want to really mention, as an African who comes from a culture where we don't talk about suicide, and even here in America, people don't really talk about suicide, except a guy like you, he's a professional. But when we get together, we don't talk about these things. We talk about how our children want a fellowship to Harvard, how my son created this. And I always wish when we sit down, we could talk about real life. Because I think this is what helps people most. Instead of knowing that Joy's son won a scholarship to Harvard or Stanford. Okay?
Yeah.
I just wish parents, grandparents, you would spend more time talking to your grandchildren and children about these things. So it's normal for them to know that they happen and they can be controlled by some of this stuff. But as a psychiatrist, I just want to ask you, you know, when you began your lecture, you thought America has the highest rates. And as an African, I want to tell you that maybe not really. Because I come from Uganda. Just last week, a guy I work with committed suicide. And just this week, I've heard of 3 people who have killed themselves. So we got to ask these questions. Now, the difference in America is you have data. In Africa, we have no data. So I would love you to comment on the global rates of suicide, you know, in developing nations. And then the other thing I've had, a friend of mine who is the chief of psychiatry in Uganda told me, Joe, if there's anything you could do for Uganda, train psychiatrists, train clinical officers, because it's overwhelming. People are just dropping dead, and nobody's talking about it. Please comment on that as a global. I imagine you're some global figure.
Okay. Thank you for your comments, by the way. They're great. Well, I think you're right about the data not always being accessible in other parts of the world. And so I think the World Health Organization, when they said that they expect depression to become the #1 cause of disability around the world, they're kind of recognizing that, you know, perhaps there's more there than we realized, but also believing that the rates of depression and suicide are growing very quickly in other parts of the world, including the developing countries. I can only speculate about the reasons for that, but I think one kind of straightforward way to think about it is that the world has very quickly become smaller. We're connected like instantaneously through technology, through social media, through, you know, news feeds, and I believe that the rest of the world is quickly becoming more like the U.S. or like the developed world in ways that are good and not good, you know. And so the traditional societies, communities, traditional ways of life are kind of disappearing everywhere, and the social media. You talked about parents being able to talk with their kids, you know, about things like mental health and depression and suicide. And I think you're absolutely right about the need for that, in part because they are talking about it with each other on social media. Now, I think we know this. Social media is driving a lot of mental health problems. And I'm not saying social media is all bad and we should ban it or anything like that. But I think the reality is that we just don't have a good handle on is that younger generations, this is their language, this is what they've grown up with, this is their way of life, and we don't understand it very well. I don't think, our generation. My own kids who are in their mid-30s were just a little early for all that. I kind of missed out on that being what they live and breathe. And I think that unless we get a handle on that, or unless we as parents or adults talk with these young people, they're getting information elsewhere and it's not good. It's not accurate, it's not helpful, a lot of it. And yeah, that's a real driver, I think, of mental health problems and even suicide, the comparison that kids do, and there's just a lot of challenges there.
Thank you very much. We're sitting here from Northfield and our Rotary Club.
Yay! I live in Northfield, I should have probably explained.
But our club just introduced to our community with sponsorship from the library and the hospital and the League of Women Voters and stuff. We showed the documentary Join or Die. And it has everything to do with social capital and keeping our democracy alive. And so you have just spoken to, that social capital, having people around you, the encouragement of other people. It reminds me of a story that my daughter teaches outdoor education to small children. And at the end of the summer, after a summer camp, she had the parents come, and she had this activity going, and the kids are coloring, and they're collecting, and, getting all their gathering of the outdoor items together. And then the kids were done, and the parents were all lined up against the building, going like this. The kids would run up and say, "Mommy, Mommy, Daddy, Daddy, look, look." And the parents are going, "Uh-huh, uh-huh, uh-huh." And she said she wished she could have taken a picture of that.
Yeah.
So we think that we are parents who are far wiser, but the upcoming parents today are stuck in that media mode as well.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we fully realize how addictive that is. Really, I mean, it is even for me, and I'm, I didn't grow up with this. It's not a native technology for me, but the dopamine hits that we get from checking the news feeds I actually don't do social media, but partly because I know I'd get addicted to it, and I don't need that in my life. But yeah, no, these gadgets that we carry right here are highly addictive, and they are changing. They're changing our brains, honestly. And if they're changing our brains at our age, what are they doing for the kids where this has been absolutely the way that they've grown up? It's an uncontrolled experiment at a huge, huge social level.
I for many years have thought what I hold in mind appears in kind. I live with that philosophy, which is let's keep our thoughts positive as much as we can. It fits with what's already been said, but how often I pick up my phone and I think now and watch the news, we're like seeking what is the thing today that we need to fear. Mm-hmm. How do we turn that around?
Yeah, right.
So
right.
Instead and Joy Lab does this actually in your podcast.
Yeah, thanks.
It helps us to reprogram, to look at what's good, what am I grateful for, instead of what is there out there that I need to fear. So.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we talked about the importance of diet, what we bring into our bodies, and kind of creates our brain chemistry. What we bring in through our senses is also creating our internal experience. And I I myself try to find the right balance between keeping my head in the sand and staying informed. And I just have to kind of monitor how much I'm getting caught up in, because there's so much to be fearful about right now. There just is. And so I'm constantly monitoring, is it just too much for me? Am I taking in too much of that which is making me fearful? And then I'll just kind of shut it off for a while. There was quite a while, I used to listen to NPR all the time, commuting and whatnot. I don't commute anymore, but I'd still listen to it when I go for my morning walks. And there were months where I just decided I just have to take a break. Recently, I've gotten back into it. I think with all the, the ice surge and the, now the war, it's just so compelling. I feel like I need to kind of know a little bit about what's going on, but I think I might have to go back on a diet again, a fear diet. And so that's part of it, is noticing what are we feeding ourselves emotionally, and is there a way we can do less of it? I think too, recognizing that fear is the emotion that we find most compelling. It draws our attention, and knowing that, I think we really need to take care that that's not the bulk of what we're taking in. That we do less of that, and we really also bring in things that are just more balanced or more positive or optimistic.
Any more questions? Well, we want to show our gratitude.
You're welcome.
There you go.
Thank you.
Well, and I think your message today and the skills you talk about are important to anybody, but looking at this demographic here, it's critical to us that we practice some of those things for our well-being, so thank you.
You're welcome.